What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios, and today I'm going to give a Grimdark paint job to possibly the least Grimdark miniature that Games Workshop produce, Sigvald the Magnificent. So recently I've been chatting away with some friends and some other channels, trying to come up with some nice spicy video ideas, as there's only so long that I can paint Space Marines before you guys get bored. Well, one of the suggestions that was put my way was that I put my Grimdark talents to use on a model that is far from Grimdark. Well, after a while of thinking and searching through the Games Workshop website, there's one model that particularly piqued my interest. Sigvald the Magnificent is probably the exemplar of the whole noble bright idea, and thus the polar opposite of Grimdark. With shining gold armour and long flowing locks of blonde hair, he's meant to be enigmatic, charismatic, and the name says it, magnificent. Upon release, Games Workshop put this model into the hands of some of the very best painters in the world. And whilst most of their paint jobs were utterly beautiful, they all seemed to stick to this whole noble bright idea, and while some of them, like Sam Lens's, was a little bit punchy, no one really embraced the dirt, the grime, and for me, this model's crying out for it. So whilst I will say that I do not put myself in the same bracket as guys like Sam Lens and Vincent Venturella, I do think that they're missing something with this model, and I think it's time to give him the Grimdark treatment. After looking at the construction of this miniature, I decided on a limited sub-assembly. Whilst the robes being attached is far from ideal, they aren't going to be the easiest to pull off as a sub-assembly, so we are just going to need to use a little bit of extra care. The head, however, slots in nicely to the neck joint, so is a perfect candidate to be painted separately. To start it all off, I began with the priming of Vallejo Surface Primer Black. I went for black as opposed to grey or to any of the metallics, as I really wanted to start nice and dark for all those shadows. I want this guy to be nice and contrasty, and that all starts here. Having let the primer dry fully, I'm going to paint up the largest volume, and probably the most eye-catching part of this model, his armour. To do this, I'm going to turn to the scale colour range, and I'm going to start with a base coat of Necro Gold. Thinned down nicely and applied using the airbrush, I'll build this up slowly so that I don't fill in any of this nice detail, and so that I get a good consistent coating. This Necro Gold is quite a nice desaturated gold that has an almost brown tone to it. Whilst it's taken me a long time to find a gold that I really liked for this Grimdark stuff, I think this may be it. To provide some highlights, I'll turn to the Elven Gold from the same range. Again, whilst considerably brighter, this is a bit more of a desaturated colour when compared to some of the super vibrant Citadel colours. I am going to apply this mostly from above, but making sure that areas like his chest, his shoulder pads and his leg plates really stand out nicely. Now this step isn't essential, but this armour is going to get a bit of a battering with oil washes, so to be better safe than sorry, I'm going to hit it with a matte varnish. This will also help in taking some of that sheen away from the metallic armour, just to dull it down a little. Once that's applied, I'll give it a while to fully dry, so it's time for a little break. Now that's done, it's time to get on with the oil washes. Using the Winsor & Newton Winton Artist oils, I'll mix up some of the burnt umber and the ivory black oils with some white spirit to create a nice wash. These oil paints are designed for use on things like canvases rather than miniatures, and there are a few oils out there that are actually designed for miniatures themselves, such as the Abteilung 502 range, but these oils have done a great job for me so far, so I'm going to stick with them. Making sure that the wash is mixed fully and that there's no clumps of pigments floating around, I'll use a large brush to gently apply this to the armour plates. I'll use dabbing motions and let the wash find its own way across the armour plates and into those recesses. This is one of my favourite things about oil washes, as they flow so much better than an acrylic wash, and they draw into those recesses so easily. This makes them amazing for panel lining. Having given the oils about 15 minutes to settle, it's time to return with a cotton bud dipped into white spirit and very gently remove some of that wash from the areas that we don't want it to sit. This works by the white spirit in the cotton bud reactivating the oil paint and then the paint being absorbed into that cotton bud. This is one of the joys and real strengths of oils and why they are so good for jobs like this. Now these oils take quite a while to dry, so I'll let this guy sit for a few hours and then I'll return just to finish off those gold tones. I'll mix up a bit of the scale colour Elven Gold that I used earlier with a little bit of the Vallejo metal colour Duraluminium. I'll apply this to some of the raised areas and the upper parts of some of those curved armour plates, just to provide the very top highlight tone. This will give a nice almost silver highlight and just push that contrast through the roof. Whilst I want this model to look nice and contrasty, I am very careful over where I apply this, as I don't want to push him back into the super bright territory of the Games Workshop paint jobs. For a bit of weathering and a little bit of colour variation on the gold, I'll use some slightly watered down nihilach oxide just to add some verdigris. With a nice small pointed brush, I'll apply this into the recesses of those armour plates and into some of the places where that oxidisation would normally occur. It's very important with this step that you work slowly and carefully. This is one of those effects that it can be really easy to overdo and apply it too strongly, which can get very distracting. Thinning the paint down can help a lot in this regard, as you can build up the effect slowly using multiple layers. For the other metallics such as the shield, the sword and some of the other smaller details, I'm going to be very unimaginative, and if you've been a fan of the channel a while, you can probably guess what I'm going to use. Vallejo Metal Colour Magnesium. Without a doubt my favourite metallic for painting silver, its ability to be applied super smooth using a brush or an airbrush means that it makes such a great base for any steel or silver surfaces. To provide a highlight on the silver, I'll turn to the Vallejo Metal Colour Duraluminium again and apply this in thin layers to build up a poor man's true metallic metal. I'll be honest, I'm not going to spend too long on this section, as with the weathering and the washes that are coming, much of this good work would be lost. To provide some shading on these areas, I'll turn to the same oil wash that we created earlier on for the gold armour and apply it liberally again. When I have the time to do so, I do prefer using oil washes to Nuln Oil for this job, due to the control that they give you and the ability to remove it from the areas you don't want it. This makes it much easier to prevent you getting any watermarks or any strange pooling from building up. Once that wash is dry, I'm also going to build up some rust effects using some of the AK Interactive rust streaks. Another staple product in my painting, this enamel wash works much like those oil washes, and when applied to metallics like this shield can give a super realistic rust effect. Applied pretty liberally and then removed after about 10 to 15 minutes by using the white spirit doused cotton bud again. It will sit in all those recesses where the rust would naturally build up and will give another nice tone and dimension to those metallic areas. If I want this to look a little bit more subtle, I'll get a very soft brush that's slightly damp with white spirit and just use this just to feather and blend the edges of that effect. You do need a really soft touch with this though, as it can be really easy just to wipe it all away again. As a final touch for these metallics, I'll go back to that thinned down nihilach oxide and again very sparingly apply this to the recesses of those steel areas. This will give those areas just a little bit more visual interest, and it's another thing to help unify all the elements of this model. Now all the metallic areas are completed, so I'm going to move on to another particularly eye-catching part of this model, that massive flowing cloak hanging from his shoulders. Now the Games Workshop paint job for this guy has him with a super vibrant purple cloak, And whilst I want to keep some of that colour palette in place, I'm going to go with a much darker and more reserved tone. Starting with a couple of thin coats of the Vallejo Hex Lichen, this will serve as a great base tone. It's important to make sure that these coats are thin, as too much paint applied can give strange textures and brush marks that you really don't want, so keep it thin and do Duncan proud. For the highlights, I'm going to use my airbrush, but I'll be honest, I absolutely hate the process of masking up a model, so instead I'm going to put some trust into keeping my hand steady. Mixing in some Vallejo Warlord Purple into that Hex Lichen, I'm going to very slowly and very carefully apply this to all those raised areas of the cake. As I'm using the airbrush, it does make it easier for me to build up the layers in the areas that I want with a nice smooth blend. So slowly I'll work it up so that the top of these raised areas get to full opacity, and that will give me a nice range of tones and, more importantly, a super smooth blend. You will surely have noticed that bit of bubbling out the top of my paint pot. This is because I was an idiot and didn't clean the brush properly after an earlier step, so I got some dried paint stuck in one of the seals. Remember kids, don't be like me, look after your equipment. For the underside of the cloaks, I'm again going to use the Games Workshop paint job as a reference, but I'm going to Grimdark it up a bit. I want this to be a nice off-white colour that I can cover in dirt and dust, so first I'm going to have to do something to cover up that black, just to make it easier for me to apply the mid-tone. For this, I'm going to use a couple of coats of Steel Legion Drab. For the off-white itself, I'm going to use the Citadel Wraithbone. I am applying this a bit fast and loose, as I actually don't mind getting a bit of texture here. When the washes are applied, this can actually help to give it a little bit more of a beaten and worn effect. To provide the shading again, I'm going to go back to that oil wash that I used all the way back when we were doing that gold. I'll apply this all over the material and then let it dry for about 10 minutes or so. Then, using this cotton makeup remover pad dipped in white spirit, I'll carefully remove some of the wash from the raised areas, and then using the pad I'll also gently blend it to give a nice smooth finish. To give a tiny bit more contrast, I'll then grab a dry brush and do a very light dry brushing of the Citadel Wraithbone onto the raised areas just towards the end of the cloak. For all the detailing on the cloak and on the shield and sword, I'm going to use the same methods as I did for the armour, just to tie them in nicely, and since I've already shown you that, I won't bore you with it again. So I'm happy that the bulk of the miniature is done. The armour and the weapons are looking pretty good, and that flowing cape is looking majestic. But he is missing one thing: his head. For the hair and the skin tones, I do need to brighten up that primer a bit, so using some Liquitex white ink, I'll build up a few pre-highlights in certain areas of the hair and on his face. This will make it much easier to apply the lighter tones that I need for the skin and for the hair, but it'll also give some nice variation. For the hair, I'm going to stick with a blonde of the Games Workshop paint job, but I want something a little bit more realistic than that bright golden blonde. So loading up some Xandri dust into my airbrush, I'll slowly build up the layers on the hair. Letting the opacity build up gradually and then leaving some of those shadows and highlights to show through, this will give me a bit of depth. After that has dried, I'll head back in with a normal brush loaded with some watered down Rakarth flesh, and I'll pick out all of those individual strands. For those areas that I put in the spot highlights, and for some of the higher areas, I'll apply this just a little bit stronger to give the impression of it being just a bit brighter. Now, to take a little bit of the yellow out and give us a bit more recessed shading, I'll turn to the crowd favourite, Agrax Earthshade. Thinning this down ever so slightly with water, I'll apply this carefully to the hair and let it settle down in those recesses between the strands. This will give it all some nice definition and just push that contrast a little bit further. Now, when it comes to the skin tones, Sigvald is often portrayed as quite androgynous with almost feminine features. He's often painted with quite soft skin tones, and I'm going to stick with a similar theme. Starting off with a base coat of Cadian Flesh Tone, I'll apply this in a couple of thin coats again just to try and avoid building up any unwanted textures. We do want this looking nice and smooth after all. For the highlighting, I'll mix in a bit of Wraithbone to the Decadent flesh tone and apply this carefully and nice and thin across all the raised areas such as his nose, his forehead and the upper parts of his cheeks. For this, I need to try and apply this as smoothly as possible, as if you don't get enough of a blend between the skin tones, the highlights will look pretty stark and not particularly feminine. To finish off the skin tones, I'll get a nicely thinned down Reikland flesh shade, and I'm going to apply this carefully to the eye sockets and across that hairline just to give a little bit more depth and some definition. For those massive horns on his head, I want to stick with something fairly subtle, and I'm going to keep with the current colour palette and base coat them in Rakarth Flesh. This tends to be my go-to base colour for bone at the moment, as it's very easy to highlight and actually takes washes really well. To provide that nice transition between the bone and the dark black tips, I'll start off by carefully glazing some Agrax Earthshade, making sure that I draw the brush towards the tip of the horns, which is where I want the higher concentration of this colour to sit. I'll then get some thinned down Abaddon Black, and after putting a small dot at the very tip, I will again glaze this in towards the tip just to blend it down into those brown tones. So now with his head all finished, I can attach this to the rest of the model, and that leaves us only a few small details left to do. As he is a Prince of Slaanesh, he obviously has a lot of gems on his armour, and for these I'm going to stick with the same colour palette and give him some nice purple gems to match that cloak. I'll initially start off by applying the darkest colour, which will be the Vallejo Hex Lichen. Generally, when refracting the light, gems will appear darker towards the top and then lighter down towards the bottom. So once that's dried, I'll add in some Warlord Purple again, and then apply this on the lower 2/3 of the gem. With some pure Warlord Purple, I'll then pop in the highlight in a small crescent shape towards the bottom corner, and then adding in a little spot of white into that deepest shade will give the impression of a nice reflective gem. So now the armour and weapons, the cloak, the skin and hair tones, and even the little gems are all painted. So what else could I be needing to add to this miniature? Well, he may look like he has some fairly beaten up armour and weapons, and that material looks a bit worn, but at the moment he isn't really showing any effects of his environment, and that's what the Grimdark style is all about. We need to make it look like Sigvald here is in the middle of a battlefield, and at the moment he's still way too clean for that. Now, although he looks like he stood in front of a massive fan in a kind of 80s hair metal style, that cloak wouldn't normally be blowing behind him quite so majestically, so I want to add some mud and some dust to the bottom of that cloak to make it look like it has been dragging in the dirt a bit. I'm going to use the AK Interactive Streak and Grime for this job, another enamel wash just like the rust streaks. It has a nice greenish brown tone to it, which will give a good impression of some dried mud on that material. Applying this straight out of the pot onto the lower areas of both sides of that cloak, I'll let it sit a while. Just like the rust streaks, I can return to it with the cotton bud dipped in white spirit and just blend and soften the edges of where I've applied it, leaving a nice dirty effect. For some mud splatter on the cloak, I'm going to use another AK Interactive product in the Dirt Splatter effect. This is a pretty thick texture paint designed for putting mud and dirt onto tank tracks for dioramas. To get a nice splatter effect with this, I'll grab an old and fairly beaten up brush and my airbrush. Dipping the brush into the dirt effect and then holding it against the area that I want to apply the effect to, I'll use the airbrush to blow just air through the brush, no paint, and this will cause the paint to flick off and stick to the miniature. This helps with getting a nice, real random application so that it looks much more natural. Now, whilst I still have the brush and the airbrush out, I'm going to use the same method to apply some nice blood splatter. Using a bit of kitchen roll to mask off the area underneath the shield, I'll mix up some blood for the blood god and some typhus corrosion, and then exactly like before, I'll use the airbrush to blow some air through that brush, giving me some nice blood splatter all over that shield and that sword. If you want more details on how to pull off this effect, I do have it in a previous video. Now, I'm not going to go into how I painted his base, as this would make the video way too long, but if you are curious, then I will drop a link in the description below for a previous video where I used the same basic techniques. We do, however, need to tie him into his base though. So to do this, I'm going to grab out the Vallejo Burnt Umber pigment that I did use for his base, and I'll apply this around his feet and the lower parts of his legs and across the bottom of that cloak to really tie him in nicely to that base. And with that, Sigvald the Magnificent, Sigvald the Grim, is now complete. So I've got to say, I'm really happy with how this guy came out. It really is quite an iconic miniature, and having seen so many bright and shiny paint jobs, it really felt right to see how good we could get him covered in a bit of dirt and grime. Generally, gold is one of my least favourite colours to paint when going for a Grimdark style, as most of the paints on the market that I found tend to be a bit too vibrant, a bit too saturated, or like the Games Workshop paints, just a bit too yellow. But I will say that in the scale colour golds, I think I might have stumbled upon a winning recipe. If you like what I've done with Sigvald the Grim, then please hit that like button down below, and maybe leave a nice ego boosting comment down in the comments box. Alternatively, if you've not liked it, then I'd be really interested to know what you would want to do differently. If you'd like to support the channel, then in the description down below, I have left my affiliate link for the awesome guys over at Firestorm Games. On their site, you can pick up any of the products that I've used in this video, and they are one of the few companies that I found in the UK that actually keeps a really good stock of the AK Interactive products, and at a fairly decent discount as well. Otherwise, if you want to support the channel, but you don't want to part with any cash, then please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. The YouTube algorithm does really like when you do that. So thanks for watching this video, guys, and remember, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.